So it turns out Karl Marx hated the poor, was a giant racist, and abandoned his son. We'll talk about that on this episode of Stopping Socialism TV. Before we get into all of that, though, we've got to tell you, YouTube is not doing us any favors when it comes to showing our videos to different people. So we need you. We need your help. You need to share this content. Like it when you see it on Facebook, and most importantly, subscribe. You have to become a subscriber so that our content will filter into all of your, suggested videos that they want you to watch. So I just want to put that little disclaimer out here up front before we jump into Karl Marx's dark past. So Justin, maybe you can kick us off here. On stoppingsocialism.com, we have a number of these articles talking about Karl Marx, but if you're just going by like the media portrayal of him, he seems like he's fighting for the little guy, and we should be almost looking up to this guy.
Yeah, the really interesting thing about Karl Marx is that there's this, I think, because of sort of what has happened in recent years and the American socialist movement and everything, and the way that it's being sold as this just incredibly compassionate plea for providing people with higher wages and single payer healthcare and all this kind of stuff. People have this perception of Karl Marx, and really most of the history of the socialist and communist movements throughout the world, as being this very compassion focused thing. But when you study the history of it, the vast majority of them were not compassionate. They were actually quite hostile towards other groups of people, and not just people who were rich, not just upper middle class people, but also poor people, also different racial groups that were considered to be sort of reactionaries, or people who were resistant to change, people who were anti-revolutionary, people who did not want a dramatic overthrow of the existing order. Because you got to understand that that's really what, at the core of Marxism, they were all expecting for many, many decades, that there would be this radical transformation, that it would kind of happen somewhat suddenly. And so anyone who stood against revolution was considered to be part of the problem. If you're not with us, you're against us, that kind of thing. Even other socialists who weren't considered, radical enough were often ostracized from these communities. So these people were very, very radical, and they lived this out throughout their entire lives, and they viewed themselves as being radical, and they saw that as a good thing. And they were very open about their racism. They were very open about their views on society and family and all sorts of other things. And so these articles really help to illuminate the truth of who these people really are, using quotes from their own writings and things that they said in speeches and other things. So it's not us making this stuff up. This is what they said, and we're quoting them throughout all of these stories so that you can see the truth.
Yeah, it was kind of a surprise to me when I was reading this article on stoppingsocialism.com. Karl Marx despised society's poorest people. So it kind of was a surprise to me to find out that, his idea of this socialist revolution was going to be propelled by the middle class. That he thought this was like a working class, a middle class thing that was going to, take the means of production and kind of take over the whole, economy, the whole society, right? And he's got this term for the people that he saw that were below that working class. And it's right here, the lumpen proletariat, which can be loosely translated to social scum, the dangerous class, the underclass, ragamuffin, riffraff, ragged proletariat, where he saw that these people he couldn't trust, and that they would just go to whatever side is offering the most stuff, which he thought that the richer class would be able to offer them the most stuff. So he despised them. And some of these quotes about it are kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
Kind of ridiculous. But it kind of, flies in the face of just kind of the media portrayal that we're supposed to buy into. And I think one of the jokes that we made a little while back is he would have hated everybody in the chop zone, like Chaz Chop, whatever it's called.
Yeah.
He'd have hated all those people. They're lumpen proletariat. He hates them.
Yeah, it's true. And I think really, when you understand what the main complaint of Marxism is, the actual Marxism, it kind of makes sense, because really what Marx was so unhappy with was this idea that, You have all these people toiling away all day long in factories. I mean, that was the world that he lived in. They're toiling in factories all day long under horrible working conditions. And then at the end of the day, this big fat cat capitalist that owns the factory gets all the money and these workers get scraps, right? Like that was his primary complaint. Well, the people who are just like living off of the welfare state don't fit into any of this. Mm-hmm. So it's not like he was saying, hey, we need to take from the rich to give to people who choose not to work. That's pretty much the modern socialist movement in many ways. Instead, he was saying, hey, we need to make sure that the workers get more money and share the wealth equally because they're getting screwed by the factory. And so there's very much like this owner of the business versus the workers of the business, and the other people in society really didn't have anything to do with that part of it.
Yeah, and then I think my favorite of these articles that we're talking about is like that he was a horrific racist. Because again, it's like, oh yeah, we need to go full steam into this like cultural Marxism because minority status people are being oppressed. And it's just like, well, if you left it to Karl Marx, like he saw that certain people or certain races were like incompatible with like civilized society. And he really hated Jews too, which is
he really hated Jews. He really did. He hated them so much. It's really amazing. I mean, in fairness, he hated lots of racial groups. So he was pretty racist in general. But the groups that he seems to have hated the most were Jews, and Slavic groups and other Eastern Europeans. He really didn't like them. He saw them as being backwards people. He saw the Jews as being, very much like what you would hear from Hitler and other people later on, sort of controlling society and pulling the strings because they control the money and banking and all of this, the typical, like, the stereotypical crazy Jewish conspiracy theory stuff. He was very into all of that. And he really didn't like the Slavs because he saw them as being backwards people who were resistant to change. And remember, that was a key theme of all of this. He wants change. He wants radical change. He wants to upend the social order entirely. And so any group of people that were standing in the way of that, and he saw that as, some societies are going to advance faster than other societies, and the slower societies are dragging down all the faster ones. And that's limiting the ability for the world to move towards this revolution. And the only way for us to get beyond that is to basically, crush these inferior groups of people. I mean, again, like it's amazing to me that in a world or in a country where it's like anyone who ever said anything racist, let's say even 150 years ago, like we're gonna cancel them because they're just the worst people that's ever lived. But the entire left-wing ideology, the father of all modern socialist movements, the father of it, the face of it, was a horrible racist in every sense of the word. And not only was he just like a racist, but he was also, it was deeply a part of his ideology too. It was part of his understanding of how the world will progress. He saw himself as being a sort of in line with Darwin, in that he believed in social Darwinism, and he sort of saw himself as seeing that kind of thing play out in society. And Darwin was a horrible racist too. And it was a very common thing back then. It was this belief that the people who are struggling in the world are struggling in large part because they are inferior in some way. And it's either genetics or it's culture or it's something. And that was a very common belief. And Marx was right in line with all of that. And so how can anybody call themselves a Marxist when that was part of the Marxist ideology? That's pretty astounding. It's not like when you say, well, George Washington owned slaves. It's like, that's true. And George Washington should not have owned slaves. But he himself admitted that it was a contradiction and that it was a problem and that they needed to do something about it. He wasn't like saying black people are scum of the earth all over the place. That wasn't part of his belief system per se. He was, probably a racist, like just about everybody in that period of time. But Karl Marx lived long after that. And it was part of his ideology to the point
Right.
where you couldn't separate the two things out. And I think that's a hard thing for those people to overcome. It's just that nobody knows it. If people actually knew this and talked about it, it would be very hard for socialists to distance themselves from this, since he is so intricately tied to their entire belief system. He's the most famous socialist there is.
Yeah, well, I want to get back to what this says about like the ideology here. But you had mentioned something in that last part where you were saying that, like, he doesn't want anyone standing in his way of this, cultural revolution. Well, apparently that includes his own son, because we've got this other story here on the StoppingSocialism.com where Karl Marx had a son with one of his maids. Is that right?
I can't. I think it was the family. Yes, it was. It was a maid, but it was a maid, but I believe his mother-in-law is the one that paid for the maid.
Oh, right.
So
Yeah,
technically,
no, he didn't
I
have
think,
any money.
yeah. So I think technically it was their maid, which is even worse.
So
really,
his
when you think
mother-in-law's
about
maid.
it. Yeah, I
So
think
he had an illegitimate, quote unquote, illegitimate son with this maid. And then there was concern between him and Engels that this was going to like derail his like political career and the influence that he has on this whole movement. So they decided to basically just like abandon the kid and say like, oh yeah, no, we don't even acknowledge his existence. So it's just like, oh my God.
Yeah,
This is like, we still have statues of this guy.
Yeah,
It's
they
insane.
created a very elaborate plot to make it to present the child as being the illegitimate child of Engels. Frederick Engels was Marx's closest ally and friend. Engels co-wrote the Communist Manifesto with him and helped him write some of his other works as well. And so to protect Marx, as you said, they essentially created this elaborate story where Engels is actually the father. And then Engels, because the maid continued to work for Engels even long after Marx died, the child knew that the mother was knew who the mother was and would visit the mother. But Engels really just despised this whole situation and hated it. Limited the ability for the son to come see his mother, made him come in through the servants' quarters, wouldn't let him just come in through the front door because he didn't. And my understanding from what I read from a couple of different sources, that the child never learned that Karl Marx was his father.
Hmm.
He died not knowing that. He had no idea who his father was his whole life. It didn't come out until after the fact, because Frederick Engels had told, I think, some of Karl Marx's children. He had told them about it, if I remember right. And so it's really tragic story. Really, it's very depressing.
Like, instead of just being this like Santa Claus like character, it's like, no, he's a pretty horrible human being. So I mean, just with these three stories alone, okay, like huge racist, hated poor people, abandoned his son. It's like, this is enough to get anybody in the modern age canceled, right? With cancel culture and all of that. And like, and just that alone, pointing out that kind of that contradiction of like the left that wants to cancel everybody for anything. But they're still going to like praise this guy. Like, highlighting that contradiction is like good enough for me. But can we go any further? Can we like show how like this type of stuff actually is less about just being like about how he's a terrible person, and but it also reflects on the ideology that he's proposing? Or is that a stretch?
Well, I think with certain parts of it, it probably is a stretch. But I think certainly with the racism, I think that there is a very strong argument to be made that when it comes to the racism, that really was a part of his belief system. He believed that these inferior groups, these inferior races, were going to be swallowed up by these more advanced societies. And it wasn't just racism in the sense of well, this person is of this particular ethnicity and this other person isn't. It was also very cultural. And it was very much like certain cultures are better than others. Certain are closer to this communist revolution than others. I think he saw that eventually he believed everybody would get to this communist, perfect communist world that he was imagining. But he did believe that there were groups of people who were essentially predisposed to not advancing as quickly as others. And he was, for that reason, I mean, religious people were part of this camp. He hated religion. He thought religion was slowing everything down, that it was a tool of the ruling classes and capitalist classes, etc. So it wasn't just poor people. It wasn't just certain races. It wasn't just certain cultures. It was also certain religions. It was a lot of, there was a lot there. I mean, he really was a terrible person personally, and also it was part of his ideology. And I think there is something psychological too about all of this that I think is important to point out. Obviously, there are a lot of socialists out there who are, as people, great people. No question about that. But it does say something, I think, that you have the founder of this whole movement had decided that he was more important than his child, and
Right.
because the movement's bigger than his kid, that the collective was more important than his individual child, right? And that it's more important for him to be viewed as this savior of the world than it is for him to take care of this illegitimate child. And it was more important for him to, continue pressing forward with all of his different goals so that he could make the world a better place than it was for him just to make the world a better place for his own kid. I mean, I think it does too. I do think that there's an element of that where it's like, yes, the collective always comes first.
Right.
And so if that's the way you think, then yeah, why would you care what about your child? If you believe that you're more important than your child and the movement is more important than your kid, then of course abandon your kid. Your kid is worthless, essentially. And that is exactly how they treated him. And so I do think that there's an element of that there as well.
Right. Yeah, there's no doubt. The collective is being managed by people that see entire races as being expendable. Might be
Yeah.
something to stay away from. All right, that should do it for this episode of Stopping Socialism TV. If you like these videos, you want to see more, go to YouTube, look up Stopping Socialism TV, and subscribe. Most importantly, we need those subscriber numbers to go up. You can also follow us and find a lot of our content on Facebook, Stopping Socialism. There's also a Stopping Socialism Facebook page, Stopping Socialism TV Facebook page. Obviously, stoppingsocialism.com. And we have an Instagram, a Parler account, and a Twitter account. Justin, any last words to say? Where can people find you, maybe?
At Justin T. Haskins on Facebook and Socialist Twitter.
All right. We will talk to you later.